Oh, man. Okay, welcome to episode 3, Feedback on Magnify the Middle. Today, we're talking all about feedback. Elizabeth and I are joined by Jim Kolk, Manager of Infrastructure and Service at Valmark. We're going to learn a little bit more about Jim in a minute. So today, with our feedback, we're going to kind of cover like 3 different frameworks plus a bonus. So we're going to talk about radical transparency, made famous by Ray Dalio. And then we're going to kind of do the opposite, talk about the feedback fallacy with Marcus Buckingham, close out with some radical candor that Elizabeth is going to walk us through. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, I'm going to have some closing thoughts around Buddhism. But to get started, big question, what is the worst feedback you've ever received? We'll start with you, Jim. Like, what's the worst feedback ever?
Worst feedback would probably be when I was at Target a long time ago. They had specific requirements for how fast we had to unload trucks and, get things loaded onto the shelves. But what those requirements were, I still to this day couldn't tell you. And they would just come by and like, good job, bad job. But nothing to really clarify what made it a good job or a bad job. And we're like, did I do something right? And it seemed like every day we had different standards as to what was a good job and what was a bad job.
So it was like slot machine feedback. You just pulled the arm and you had no idea what you're going to get.
I'd come in and, I just, all right, let's see what's going to happen today. Bad job. All right. So.
Nice.
Probably
that's
that.
Helpful. Yeah.
How about you, Elizabeth?
Well, I mean, I had a story and then Jim insulted my hair. So that's the most recent story of the worst feedback I've received. No, but in all seriousness, I think back early in my career when I was still a young, not too many years out of college, still pretty intimidated by my job. And I walk in to work one day and my manager is at the other side of the office. And no, it's not your dad. And my manager is at the other side of the office. And this manager screams from the one side over to the other side across all the open office doors. Yes, that.
She
what
said,
the did you do? To which I was like, good morning.
good morning. And everyone went out from their little cubes and went.
Yeah, they did. That's exactly what happened. And so on one hand, I was very clear where I stood with this manager, and I understood that I did not make this manager happy. So we were very clear on feedback. It just maybe wasn't the most helpful delivery. Mm-hmm. How about you, Joe?
I said the worst feedback ever was from my mom. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm really sorry that you're my example, but she was teaching me to cook, and I'm definitely one of those like hands-on learners. I have to learn, so I would start to learn how to cook, and it was just constant negative feedback. It was, don't do this, stop doing this, why are you doing this? And I just would feel overloaded, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to have a TV dinner. I'm done with this. So, so sometimes, even though you're giving some instruction to somebody, we'll talk a little bit more about how that can be difficult when you receive a lot of negative feedback altogether.
Yeah, can clearly shut you down.
Yeah, it can clearly shut you down. That's what happened to me.
Break your spirit.
Break your spirit.
And never cook again.
Yeah, so before we get into some of the frameworks, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about your experience, Jim, regarding feedback and kind of the different tools you've used at Valmark, and then maybe we'll take and use those tools as examples as we talk through some of the different frameworks. So Jim, I know, you kind of actually have 2 sort of different frameworks you've used for feedback. So maybe let's talk about maybe the first one is like kind of the quick feedback. Explain kind of what that is and how that's worked for your team.
Sure. So the general gist of it, we use a system called Smileback. And essentially the way it works is anytime a ticket or a case, whatever you wish to call it, comes through to the help desk queue, someone's having an issue, something's broken somewhere, someone needs batteries, whatever. When one of our technicians completes the ticket, it actually sends out an automated email to we call them requesters, but the person who submitted the ticket, for the opportunity to give them some quick, candid feedback as to how they thought the process of that ticket actually went. It's pretty straightforward, too. So we do it with just red, yellow, and green faces, smiley to frowny. Green, you had a great time, and everything was done the way you expected it to do. Yellow, maybe something wasn't exactly done to standards as you thought it would be. And red, it just completely missed the mark. Everything was way off. There's also an option for them to add comments for a little more clarity. But that's the overall gist of how the system works. Primarily, we use this just to see, one, is there an issue going on with any sort of like technician, someone not quite pulling their weight, not quite understanding what's going on in the ticket. Maybe an attitude issue could pop up or something along that line. But at the same time, it also just sort of helps us to know what people expect when they send in a ticket with, maybe very specific wording. And their wording might not actually be what they're trying to imply the issue is. So it partially could become not just an issue with our team, but maybe a training moment for someone out in the field where it's like, oh, when you're talking about this, it's actually this, and then they get to improve and understand, and that quick feedback helps us to
I like
it
that.
up.
I think that's a great example, right? Because sometimes we always think about feedback as one directional, right? And sometimes it's about opening up a conversation. So you're really talking about using that as a tool to open up a conversation, not a blame game, more of a, hey, how do we make this better so that when this thing happens in the future, I know what you need.
Right.
I'm better at getting your needs.
Right. We try to utilize it just to overall improve the process on both sides of the field.
Yeah. So
It's like attacking the process, not the person methodology.
Exactly.
yeah. So I was I love this concept of what we call like a blameless postmortem. I mean, do you want to explain that a little bit, Jim?
I'll let you take it.
Here's let me take it. Yeah.
You sound so excited
I
to
know,
talk about
I
it.
am
I gotta
excited
let
to talk
you.
about it. It's just the idea that like you're like Elizabeth said, right? It's the process, not the person, and that you're viewing it in an objective way and not just Susie or Steve did something bad and it was all their fault and they got a red and they're just bad. No, it's like, okay, well, let's figure out what happened here. I mean, I guess, do you have some coaching you use when the team does get a red? Like, what does that look like? Because I think the natural reaction is when somebody get a red is like, I did something bad. I did something wrong.
Agreed.
And I feel maybe, I don't know, maybe not great about myself.
Or
Yeah.
maybe you just get defensive and think,
Yeah.
well, it's not my fault. They should have
Exactly.
read the email. They should have understood.
Exactly. And I think that's a pretty common result as well. People tend to like to point the finger away from themselves because no one likes criticism. But it's a natural part of everything there. So the first thing we typically try to do if a red does come through, or even a yellow for that matter, is to look at the actual case because they are all affiliated with the ticket, that generated the actual notification to the user, so we can see specifically which one was which. So we'll go in and maybe I'll look at the comments and the information that the technician put in there, the original request from the person, what the technician did, maybe how long it took to actually complete everything. So get an understanding of sort of the timing and just the general details as to what led to maybe a red showing up. And if it's clear that it was something with the technician, like maybe they just were having an off day, something wasn't quite right, well, it's pretty easy to say, okay, I need to have a conversation with this employee and see what was going on. But at the same time, like I was saying before, it could be an issue on the other side of the fence. Just general lack of understanding on how a process maybe functions, or a misunderstanding even, where they think it's supposed to be one thing, but it's actually something completely different. And in that case, it's more of an education point where, like, hey, I understand why you put this in here, but this is actually what this is, and here's why it was done the way it was. So to better prepare them to understand what that is in the future, and then maybe help guide them toward the proper issue or the way of like requesting help with that for the next time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Jeff, I seem to remember you used to do an annual survey on service. What led you to switch to this more immediate feedback survey system?
Well, actually, Elizabeth, we use both. And I think there's justification for doing both. So I think you need, like Jim described, you kind of need the immediate, like, here's the tactical thing I'm doing. But I think you also need to take a step back. So I'd say, that's a great segue to the next part, Jim, is like, tell us about sort of the biannual survey you're doing with the team. And this is, this can be a little tough, right? Yeah.
Yeah, this one has led to some tough conversations in the past. So the other system we use is based off a Net Promoter Score. Jeff biannually will send around surveys to the rest of the home office employees. It has each of our names listed from the technicians department, and it basically is, have you worked with this person this year? How was your experience on a scale of 0 to 10?
There you go.
A little closer to the mic. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah,
let me just, here we go. So it's on a scale of 0 to 10, and basically my understanding of it, and please feel free to correct me, is that anywhere from 0 to 4 is a detractor. Essentially, somebody had a very bad experience with this person.
0 to 6.
0 to 6, my mistake.
Yeah.
0 to 6 is a detractor, and essentially it just means something was going wrong with this individual. They had a bad experience. The person is bringing negative value to the team. It's worth a discussion at that point. The middle ground would be just neutral.
Yeah.
Nothing's getting better, nothing's getting worse, which you could see that in a positive light, but at the same time, again, nothing's getting better. So you're not improving, you're not making the team better and giving an overall better experience for everybody. Mm-hmm. And then the top tier, we like to see 10s, but anything around that, 7 through 10, that is a, what is the actual term for it?
That'd be a promoter.
A promoter. Yeah. So the promoter is basically like, it's good. That's what you want to see typically.
Yeah.
If someone's doing the right job, they're getting very positive feedback from whoever the employee is that's rating them. They've had great experiences with them. They're doing a really good job, and you want to see that because it improves the team as an overall.
Mm-hmm. So a net promoter score theoretically could be negative 100 all the way up to 100. And there's a range of studies you'll see out there, but people would say anything, maybe like 30 and above is probably pretty good. Mm-hmm. But Jim, you've had ranges everything from a 10 up to into the 90s, right?
Yeah, we've never had. Actually, I guess we have had once with a negative score.
We did.
We did. We did. I'll get to that later.
Okay.
But I've seen from in the negatives to the very high positives.
Well, I want to pause for just a second. So, point is, you have to manage that.
Yes.
Right? So when that happens, you have to manage to that.
And that, to your point from earlier, leads to some very difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Because, at least in our experience, the biannual survey tends to be a little more open in terms of what people are willing to say. It is their overall impression of a person. So you go 6 months, you've worked with, person A of the team. Your perception of them based on your tickets, calls, personal, face-to-face experiences, it's going to be forming during that time. And after that 6 months, no matter what has happened through that point, that overall perception is what they're going to be reporting with. And that's where we actually mix it back in with the Smileback system. The Smileback is meant to fill that gap between that 6 months. So if there's intermediate problems that show up during that point, we have the ability then to, one, be notified that there is an issue, and then to correct it early on before it becomes a more habitual issue, so to speak.
So I think, Elizabeth, before we rolled this out, I think you were thinking, like, Jeff, you're crazy. Like, if my boss did this to me, I would, like...
Oh, the constant feedback?
Yeah, or like even the net promoter score, like sending that, you're like, if my boss did this to me, I would just, like, not be happy. I mean, do you still feel that way?
You just have to be ready for the honest truth to come out.
Yeah, that's hard.
Which we all should, because that's how we grow and that's how we get better.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I guess I'll make two last points, and one is, if I look at the scores over a long period of time and what it does to a team, your team to the last iteration, everyone on your team had a score of what?
It was about a 95 average.
So and it's not like it's always been that way. Right. This is the course of getting feedback, making adjustments, managing, coaching, and delivering that. And then, the other thing now is Valmark has a system called the Valmark Core Awards, which is nominated by their peers. And on your team, now you have 3 people that have won that award.
It's 3 people
service.
Of our full. Yeah, three people have won it so far. Our last person just became full-time, so we're going to see if we can make that 100%.
We'll see. Not an easy task by any stretch.
Definitely not.
So part of me would say, like, that's kind of evidence of the system working, but also recognizing that might not be for everybody. There may be some people that would be an excellent employee that could do great work, that just being subjected to that much feedback might be just not for them.
True.
I mean, maybe just in theory when they're thinking about it, but once you go through it and you realize, it's more helpful to get that continuous feedback, I think, than it is to get that one time of year feedback that comes through just based on whatever general feeling someone's thinking. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember you guys had a lot of recency bias where the comments that you would get back, Jeff, would be related to whatever someone remembered from the past month. It didn't matter that the 11 months prior to that, it was very steady, consistent, deliverable service. But that one time when something didn't work within the past month is what tend to reflect in your scores.
Exactly.
So they might feel it's a more fair system, albeit it's always there.
Yeah.
So let me ask you another tricky question. So feedback isn't perfect, right? Sometimes we receive feedback that we think isn't right. For example, if you ask a colorblind person what color something is, they'll give you an answer, but it might not be right. How do you as a manager determine when feedback is fair and unfair? Right?
It's a tough question.
It is a tough question, and I don't think that there's one really solid answer that you can give that's going to cover it all.
And is that why you need to use a bigger sample set sometimes to get a better sense of what is fair or isn't fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair too. And also part of it's just understanding that's the truth according to that person.
Yeah,
so whether
that's
you
true.
agree with it or not, that is their perception. So back to what you said earlier about what is the actual issue at hand or what is the real question they're asking, what was their real experience at the time? And maybe it's coming through saying that the issue is something that wasn't the actual issue, but there's an underlying problem there either way to address.
Yeah.
Which is what you had mentioned in the beginning, Jim, is, what is the real question they're asking?
Yeah. And to sort of go back a little bit, one point that I wanted to bring up in regards to both the systems working in tandem, I think to Jeff's point where if it was just the biannual system, it's a bit of a shock because you go 6 months and all of a sudden you get feedback, and maybe it's positive and maybe it's not, or maybe it's somewhere in the middle. Regardless, getting that much feedback for that much of a period of time, it almost can be sort of dread-inducing. Maybe not for every employee, but some people, again, to your point, Elizabeth, people don't like feedback all the time.
I think this goes back to what Elizabeth and I were talking about last session about performance reviews, right? If you just have that one annual performance review, that's the only time you get direct feedback. It can be a fear-inducing event versus maybe something more frequent that's like, okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to go off at that point, the more frequent that's where we mixed in the Smileback system. So rather than a surprise at 6 months slap in the face potentially, it's a gradual, you're getting constant feedback. So it's like, oh, okay, I've just been slowly, dipping my foot in the pool to get the temperature. And it also sort of gives you an idea of what that temperature is going to be at the very end.
Right.
So if it's relatively positive, you're likely going to have a higher net promoter score. If it's been kind of an issue the whole way along, one, good to address it earlier on, but two, it really shouldn't be a surprise if you get that slap and you're like, why did I get a negative score? It's like, have you been paying attention to what you've been getting told?
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about, Jim, we just kind of a funny story I wanted to share was feedback goes both directions. And I think as a manager or person in charge of a team, I think it's important to make sure you solicit feedback the other way. And so Jim and I have devised a system because I think employees sometimes they're afraid to give their boss feedback. So we've made it very easy to do that. And when I'm starting to make a mistake or doing something wrong, Jim and I have a safe word he uses. And
I hate that phrasing.
okay, a code word
We have
that he
a
uses.
trigger word.
Yeah, trigger word, whatever. So I'm telling him something, and he just like, dude,
That censor button.
yeah, no. So I think that, and for us, that was a fun way to make it easy for him to give feedback to me and me to not feel threatened or just I realized, okay, I need to slow down. I need to think about this and I need to hear what he's saying.
Well, the only way that's possible that Jim was able to share that feedback to you, and now it's become kind of a funny joke between the two of you. But you can pull that word out whenever you need to tell Jeff, like, oh, you've crossed that line into this territory. Is only when you've made it safe for him to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, which that's a big deal.
Yeah, I've had other managers, bosses in the past where that kind of interaction, rather than like oh, you're right, I should definitely pump the brakes for a second, it would have been a just go away. I don't want to talk to you or something.
I mean,
like
and
that.
it's
completely walled off.
Yeah, I mean, and as a top, as a boss, you have blind spots. And you have to recognize that you're a human being and you have blind spots and you get impatient, especially me. I want to move fast sometimes. And there was a time last year that I was starting to move too fast and Jim just said, whoa, slow down. And I went, you're right. And we actually pivoted off and I'm glad he did that. Had we not done that, it could have been a much different outcome.
Yeah.
So
That's great.
All right, so let's segue into some of these frameworks that people can think of. And the first framework is called radical transparency. And I think it's somewhat close to what Jim just described. This was popularized by Ray Dalio in Bridgewater. And essentially, everything everything is rated. They rate all their, if you're in a meeting, everybody has like a little tag they wear. Everybody gets rated in terms of like how they did in the meeting. Anybody can give anybody feedback. They stack rank everybody like as a manager, like 1 to 300. If you're in a management and you're at the bottom, everybody sees it and knows it. So I'm just curious, like we talked about, I think in some ways what you described, Jim, is kind of like radical transparency, like the net promoter score thing. It's not published necessarily someone's score that's just given to them individually, but we're allowing lots of people to rate them. I mean, what do you guys think of this as managers? Do you think this is good? Do you think this is problematic? What do you think about
force ranking employees?
Force ranking employees, and just the idea that anybody can give feedback to anyone at any time about anything.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of studies out there that will support force ranking being very demotivational and pretty much toxic for the work environment.
100% agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it almost creates an unhealthy level of competition at that point.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Because it's not your coworker, it's the person above you now. It's your competition, your rival. You're not working together, you're working to overtake them.
Yeah.
Yeah. There should be healthy tension to keep us all challenged in the workplace, but when there's just toxic competition.
Well, here's the other thing I was thinking about. Okay, so I'm stack ranked, right? And I feel awful. I feel bad because I'm rated last. But what if I'm part of a really successful organization? What if I'm the last place player, like for an NBA team, right? Like I don't play, I'm on the bench, but I'm still in the NBA, right? Or I'm in the major leagues. I'm not on the farm team. So even if I'm last, I'm still on the best team. But we don't think of ourselves that way. We think of ourselves as last because we were force ranked against everybody else.
Here's the thing, Jeff. In the NBA, do you think the second rated player feels that way? Do you think they feel great about being the second
They
rated
probably
player?
don't. I don't. Probably not.
I don't think so.
No, it's tough. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we're saying radical transparency.
Yeah.
All right.
Not a fan of it.
Not a fan. All right. So the next one is the feedback fallacy. And what I like about this is that it's much more of a positive focus. So instead of focusing on shortcomings, which they say doesn't enable learning, it impairs it. They say to have a much more positive approach, or to recognize that there are many different paths to success. So, for example, they would say, if somebody's good at a sport, there's a lot of different ways to do it, right? You could be, a really good three-point shooter, or you could be really good from the foul line, or you could be all of these different things. So there's a lot of different ways to score points, and just letting people sort of use their natural abilities as opposed to, critiquing them. And they just talked a lot about kind of the idea of like fight or flight, and that people get, sort of locked down thinking, that sort of thing. So I think the other part that people wonder about with this whole feedback fallacy concept is that, well, that sounds great, but sometimes people still need feedback, right? Like you still can't see everything and you need feedback. And Elizabeth, I thought you could walk us through just like a couple of really interesting ways to phrase things differently that might be helpful.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff. I mean, I think, when you're giving feedback and with this concept here, it's not necessarily just about, just the positive focus, what you did well. And when you're delivering that criticism or that feedback, it's not just that direct, what didn't go well. It's more of a like bringing them through it, talking them through it. And it's the way that you deliver that doesn't automatically shut them down or get them in that defensive mode to be like, well, again, back to my example on your smile back. If you had read the original email, you wouldn't have wondered, how to fix this problem on your own. So there's some ways that you can walk through an employee. I'll just pick out some of these examples here. Instead of just coming out with, here's what you should do. You can say, this is what I would do. This is what worked with me, and give them a couple examples of that. Instead of just, good job, like your boss at Target, and leaving it at that.
Yeah, being specific.
Yeah, like here's some things that work for me. Pointing out the things that you did, what went well with what you did, so like the yes, that, like continue doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of, here's what you need to improve, you can say, this is what seems to work best in this role. Why don't you try doing some of this? Instead of, that really didn't work, you could say, when you did X, it caused Y, or I felt Y. Does that make sense? You need to improve your communication skills. I love this. We get this feedback all the time at Valmark. We need better communication. I'm always like,
what does that mean? What
Okay,
does
I'm-
that
vague
mean?
I want to
topic.
deliver on that.
What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. So I changed the question. This is like going back years.
Would you like me to send it via pigeon carrier to you? I'm not sure.
I mean, that could mean so
Telegram
many
carrier,
things.
please.
Telegram. Yes, now we're communicating well.
Yes.
Yeah. So just sort of a little tangent here. I changed the question. So they couldn't just come back with a blanket. You need better communication. What are 3 ways we can improve communication specifically? So you could try saying, here's exactly where you started to lose me in that point that you made.
Because then it's specific and I know what to change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. You need to be more responsive. You could switch to, when I don't hear from you, I worry that we're not on the same page. So these are they're saying the same general thing. It's just the first example it just sits out there and it stays out there. And you don't really know what to do with that. The second one kind of gives you a little more explanation of why am I feeling this way.
And it explains it from that own person's perspective, right? Because they recognize, I don't know what's going on with you, but I'll just tell you what's going on with me.
Yeah.
And then just kind of leave it at that and then put it on the other person to okay.
Yeah. Like, here's what I'm observing.
Yeah.
You know, are you noticing this well? Can you help me explain why I'm feeling this way? Yeah. So those are just some examples of different ways you can restate that issue.
All right. So the last major framework is radical candor. So this is a really popular book. I know you really like this book, Elizabeth, and it's
Yeah.
kind of based on 4 frameworks or 4 quadrants rather. Can you walk us through what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So radical candor comes from a book written a couple years ago by Kim Scott, and it basically frames out a feedback system that is the intersection of caring personally and challenging directly. Okay? So what's radical about it is that those aren't typically done together.
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of confusion with this book, right? So radical candor, I think on its surface, people thinks just be a jerk.
Right.
But that's what they think.
Yeah, because the word radical kind of makes it sound like you're doing something really off the charts, right? But what they mean by that is do those together. Okay, challenge directly, care personally. And what tends to happen is you do one or the other. Okay? So what that would look like is, I don't care about you as a person, but I'm more than willing to give you this criticism, which comes across like I'm just a jerk, right? The flip side is, I care about you, but I'm not willing to give you that criticism because maybe I'm afraid of hurting your feelings. So I'm a nice guy, but I'm doing nothing to help you at all. And they're both harmful, right? And I guess you would have a fourth situation, which is, I'm fine criticizing you, and also I don't care about you. So
Completely negative.
that's the worst, right?
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
jerk boss.
yeah.
The
That's
most
the jerk
toxic
boss.
it could be.
Yeah. Sorry, that would be, I don't give you the criticism, and I don't care about you. So I'm just a ghost. I'm doing nothing for you.
Nothing at all.
Yeah, nothing for you at all.
So the goal then is to get into this radical candor zone where we care a lot about somebody and we can give them direct feedback.
Yeah.
So what are some strategies for doing that?
Well, one thing that I want to point out is it's best to at least make sure you're getting that. I will call it that structured feedback out there. I always think criticism has such a negative tone to it, but get it out there one way or another. So there was an article that came out in the New York Times years ago, which actually inspired this book, that said most people would rather have a boss that's a total jerk than a boss that says nothing at all, which really comes across as an employee as the boss is incompetent at their job. Because if you're unwilling to coach me, if you're unwilling to challenge me to step up to do the job that I'm expected to do, and therefore I'm just going to eventually fail, then you're an incompetent boss, and I'd rather you be a jerk and give me that feedback.
Because at least the jerk cares.
Yeah. So ways that you're going to do that is first it starts with the caring. You got to start that foundation of caring about the person, building that trust with the person, making that psychological safety with them. Once you have that foundation and establish that connection with your employee, when you are delivering the criticism, the employee knows you're doing it because you care about them. And it's so much better received and more motivating to do your job better. Yeah.
Yeah.
So get it out there.
Get it out there.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the best feedback on how to get that done is criticize quickly. Do not wait. Don't overthink it, because the more you overthink it and the more you wait, the less likely you are to do it. So right at the moment something happens, pull that person aside privately, have that conversation with them. It's going to be more honest. It's going to be more off the cuff, and it's going to be direct.
So I think sometimes when we care about somebody, we want to be careful with our words. And I think our tendency is to wait, and then it builds, and then it becomes this event, right? As opposed to not a big deal. Hey, just so you know, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Move on.
It gets awkward the longer you wait.
It
Yeah.
also, I think, could be, to an extent, I feel like if the issue happens and you don't address it, and then it happens again, and then you address it, the employee is also going to wonder, like, well, why didn't you tell me this last time? So, yeah, rip the Band-Aid off. Just, hey, look, this is a problem. We need to correct this.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the basic concept. It's, really about caring personally for the person, being able to have that vulnerability with them, sharing that feedback, for them to be able to ask for help when they need help, for them to be able to ask for feedback, just openly, two ways. That's the foundation of it. And then make sure you are delivering those areas where they could grow.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, so we're going to end with 5 Buddhist teachings, what I think is really interesting around speech. I read this years ago, and I just was like, wow, I thought it was simple and easy to follow. So the first is when you're saying something to somebody, I think this is, for me, it's helpful with feedback. First, is it factual and true? Like, are you just saying something and is it true, or are you just whatever? The second is it actually helpful, right? So if somebody has some sort of limitation in their life, and if you're giving them feedback and they can't do anything about it, that's just, why? Like, that's not good. So I think sometimes as a manager, sometimes you might give somebody feedback and it's just like, it's above their capability. So it's not worth it. And next one is spoken with kindness and goodwill. And I think that goes back to your caring, like in Radical Candor, you actually have to care about the individual. And then endearing. That is spoken gently in a way that the other person can hear. And I've wondered about that. Like the person on the other side, right? Like, was it said in a way that they could hear it? Or did you do it just, they got so off-put or they were so on defense that they couldn't even hear what you were saying.
Yeah.
And then the last one is timely. Like Elizabeth, you just mentioned, pull them aside. Don't do it in front of everybody. Or, sometimes you do want to do it quickly, maybe, but you might not be able to have the right time. It might be a week or two later. And you feel like the urge to do it right away, but for whatever circumstance, you might need to wait or do it at a different moment. So I just share those. I thought those were just interesting as I try to think about when I give feedback.
I'd almost throw a 6th one in there.
Okay.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Set personal bias aside.
Okay, give me more.
So to the concept of giving feedback, everybody has sort of their way of how they want something to be done. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only way or the absolute correct way. And to that point, if you see something happening and you're like, that's not the way we've always done it or anything along that line.
Oh, those are
Elizabeth's
bad
favorite
phrase.
words right there.
That's outlawed.
And to that point, though, it's like, well, they aren't doing it the way that you know that it needs to be done, but what's wrong with their way? And maybe that's the reverse of the feedback there, where it's them providing the feedback to you in a sense of, like, I know we do it this way, but look at this way.
Yeah, that's awesome. That goes back to that feedback fallacy of just like, hey, there is 10 different ways to do it. And focus on catching those positive moments and encouraging whatever their behavior is to get the result that's positive. And it may be doing something that if you tried to do it, it would fall apart. And your feedback, we don't do that. But for them, it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Jim just gave us a great principle for a future podcast on delegating, because that's a key principle to delegating.
I'll send you my bill.
Send your bill. All
You
right.
can't delegate and micromanage at the same time.
Awesome. All right, so this was a Magnify the Middle episode on feedback. We talked about radical transparency, the feedback fallacy, radical candor, and some thoughts around Buddhism. Jim, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Stay safe.